Right, welcome everybody. We will go ahead and get started here in just a couple of minutes, just giving people the last couple of minutes to trickle in. All right, we'll go ahead and kick off. Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Andrew Riggs. I'm Vice President of Success Services for Devo. I'll be leading you through a presentation today on demystifying SIEM migrations. Before we get started, I do want to let everyone know, I know there's some questions about the Uber Eats gift cards. Those will be emailed out to you at the end of the presentation. And if you don't receive those, you can reach out and our team will make sure that that gets taken care of for you. So with that said, I'm very excited about this presentation for today. This is something that we've been getting a lot of questions about, a lot of requests for me personally. My background here is I've actually built the professional services program in North America at Devo over the last several years. And my team has migrated well over 100 customers from various SIEM solutions onto the Devo platform. And the presentation today is kind of going to be two main components. First, we're going to talk about kind of how your organization can prepare for a SIEM migration, things that you can do to set yourself up for success, as well as the different strategies and execution methods that we've seen throughout our experience that companies will utilize to approach these types of large migrations. Now, this is targeted towards SIEM, but it actually really could be applied to almost any large-scale technology migration from one platform to another. And those first three parts are going to be largely non-specific to Devo. This is more kind of strategy and a high-level view. And then the last piece is we'll walk through Devo's approach that we take to migrations, which can be utilizing any of the migration strategies or execution methods, but it's kind of our process that we've seen be successful with the customers that we've moved over to the platform. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A, and we'll get to some of those at the end of the presentation. And if there's any we don't get to, we'll see if we can follow up with those after the presentation as well. All right, so first things first, what can you do for your organization to prepare yourself for a SIEM migration? There's a number of things, but the most important thing you can do is to start planning in advance. My recommendation is to start planning a minimum of 6 months in advance of when you're going to need that product to go live. You need to allow time for yourself to evaluate the vendors in the marketplace, to understand your requirements and your reasons for switching to a new product. Always should assume that there's going to be some sort of delay in procurement. A lot of us like to think we can push through a large purchase like this in a short period of time, but oftentimes there's legal with contracts or things that kind of slow down that process. So just account for that in your planning stages. The actual migration itself, depending on the approach that you take, we've seen them go anywhere from a few weeks on the shorter ends to several months for some of these very large organizations moving tens of terabytes or hundreds of terabytes of data from one SIEM to another. And you also need to ensure that you're allowing time for your personnel, your employees, to ramp up on the new platform. There needs to be some time for them to complete online training or certifications and get comfortable with that platform. So when you do hit your go live date, you're not going to see a significant drop off in productivity. You really want to be able to maintain your operations at the same level that you had in your previous product. And last item in bold there, do not wait until your current SIEM license is about to expire. If you do that, you're oftentimes going to end up incurring additional cost because either it's going to be a huge professional services bill to expedite an implementation, or you're going to have to renew some sort of temporary part of your existing SIEM license to kind of bridge the gap between that and your new product. So that the sooner you start planning, the better you're going to be set up for overall success. A couple of additional items here. Understanding your goals. So why are you looking to change your SIEM product? Is it simply because of cost? I know this is one item that we hear frequently is, hey, my bill for whatever SIEM I have is extremely high, and I want something else. If that is your only reason for looking to move a SIEM product, it's actually oftentimes a little bit challenging to see success in those projects, because usually those types of clients are so in love with their existing SIEM, they think it's perfect. They just want that SIEM, but cheaper. But no two SIEMs out in the market are exactly identical. They each have their own nuances, their own interfaces, their own languages for queries. And so really understanding the driving factor there is important. Now, if you're looking for kind of beyond cost and your reason for moving outside to a different SIEM is something like lack of functionality, maybe there's certain features or applications not available in the SIEM that you have, or performance or scalability. These are the two that we see most frequently with customers coming to Devo, is they're looking for a platform that can scale and be faster than what they have in the past, kind of moving to a cloud native type solution that can handle mass scale data ingestion, maybe real-time alerting, things like that. Really document what of those are important for your organization, because that's going to drive what you're looking for when you're evaluating the players that are out in the market right now. And utilizing that, you can then go ahead and build what your definition of success is. Very clearly articulate before you even select your vendors. You should be looking at, what does success mean for me as part of this project? Am I looking for an exact copy of what I had in my legacy SIEM? Meaning I want to move over every single piece of content that I had. Or is there certain specific improvements that I'm looking to see? Something maybe my legacy SIEM didn't do or was not particularly good at, that I want to make sure that the new SIEM can accomplish that use case. Also, identifying your project team. This one's really critical. Who is going to be working with the vendor implementation team to actually get this product deployed? There's some recent surveys that have come out that have talked through kind of how, especially in cybersecurity, it is very common for companies to purchase technologies, but not actually get them fully implemented all the way to production. Helping to identify your team up front and involving them in that process is going to more ensure that you're able to successfully get actually fully deployed to production, because that team is actually going to be involved not just in vendor selection, but also maybe POC planning criteria or success criteria for what success means for the project. And definitely plan your POC. Most of these vendors in this space are used to doing POCs. So make sure that whatever POC you're going to do, it's best to keep it as confined as possible. Big, wide, broad POCs don't generally benefit either the vendor or the customer, but specific targeted POCs that focus on those success criteria that you identified as must-haves for you are really the best way to ensure that you're getting the product that meets your use cases, and then you'll then be able to deploy it in the manner that meets your success criteria. And make sure you're jointly developing your statement of work with your vendor implementation team. You have to have both sides of the project on the same page with regards to what that success criteria is, and make sure that it's defined in the statement of work so that there's no ambiguity around the overall success of the project. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a couple of different types of migrations that we've seen, and then kind of within each type of migration, there's sort of two different execution methods that you can utilize. But we'll go ahead and talk about the types first. So the first one here is going to be the carbon copy migration. So carbon copy is what I referred to earlier. That is going to be where you are essentially taking every piece of content and moving it over from your legacy SIEM, as opposed to a value-based migration, where a value-based migration is prioritizing extracting the native value from your new SIEM rather than migrating legacy content. So this is a type of migration that's utilized by customers who generally are looking to move off their legacy SIEM because there's something it's not doing for them. And they are looking to get either a next generation product or a different product that has its own set of functionality that they're interested in, and then maybe kind of bridging the gap between their legacy SIEM, but they're not really necessarily interested in moving over every single alert and every single query and every single dashboard. To do this, though, requires an understanding of the functionality offered by the SIEMs in the market and mapping that to your data sources. You need to make sure that you're probably going to get some big fancy demo from a SIEM vendor, and it's going to show you a lot of bells and whistles and things that look great. But if your organization doesn't have the data sources necessary or a license that will allow you to ingest those data sources, you're not going to get that capability out of that product. So you need to ensure that you have that mapping of what you have, the license that your organization can afford, and ensure that you understand what capabilities you're going to be getting out of that new SIEM product. An advantage of this approach is that it typically has a lower implementation cost because you're not having to pay your vendor for professional services to translate all of this content from your legacy SIEM to your new SIEM. It's really going to be focused on getting the SIEM deployed, which if it's a cloud native one is quite easy. You spin up a domain and you're done. And then ingesting the various data sources that you have. But the actual services time necessary will be very minimal. It also leads to a shorter implementation timeline because the biggest driver of time in a SIEM implementation is that migration of content from the legacy SIEM to the new SIEM. That type of translation is not always necessarily straightforward, and different SIEMs do things different way, and you're going to end up paying a professional services bill and have a time associated with that. The last thing on this, though, is that this can lead to changes in protected threat surface. So if you have one SIEM and you're moving to a different SIEM and you're not going to be moving content over, you need to understand what your threat surface was before with the alert detection coverage that you had, and then also what your new product offers, and make sure that you're not somehow substantially reducing your coverage in your threat surface with the new product. The carbon copy migration, as I mentioned, is when you're doing a direct one-to-one copy of all the content use cases from the legacy SIEM. This is everything. So queries, alerts, dashboards, custom applications, if they're there, third-party integrations, basically anything that you had has to somehow be translated. As you mentioned earlier, this does lead to a higher implementation cost and a longer implementation timeline. It can also lead to kind of this perception of my new SIEM is just the same thing as my old SIEM, but with a different skin. So slightly different UI, but really it's the same thing because I just basically re-implemented everything that I had. The advantage here can be, though, that you're not looking at a change in your threat surface. So from a, I guess, business risk perspective, that can actually help bring down business risk if that is an overall concern. All right, so now the two different execution methods, and these are really important. These are going to kind of vary depending upon the timeline that you have, and also some things maybe like your compliance requirements that you may have. So there's two different ways we see this done. There's either what we call a parallel execution or a cutover execution. And we'll talk through kind of each of those and the pros and cons of each. So your parallel migration is when you're basically going to run both SIEMs in parallel for some defined period of time where data is being ingested into both. This reduces your business risk because as you're ingesting into the new SIEM, you have a chance to tune and optimize and stabilize the environment, as opposed to doing kind of a hard cutover, as we'll talk about in the other execution method. This also allows for an easier content migration. So if you are going to be doing that carbon copy, now I can have both SIEMs live with the same data feed. So as I'm implementing content, whether it's an alert or a query or a dashboard, I have the option to compare against the previous one and ensure that I'm meeting or exceeding the performance or capability of that same piece of content in the legacy SIEM. And this next bullet's really important. So this method can reduce or eliminate the need for historical data migration. I cannot stress, no matter what SIEMs you're looking at, even if it's not Devo, if you are considering a SIEM migration, if you are able to somehow reduce or eliminate your need for historical data migration, it is going to save you a ton of time and a ton of money. Historical data migrations are something that is necessary for customers that maybe have a long compliance requirement of, okay, they must have at least 1 year of data or 7 years of data in their SIEM. Those can be challenging because not all SIEM products allow you to extract data in its raw form, and the data that gets extracted from one SIEM may not directly map into how your new SIEM is going to store that data. And so while it might be possible to ingest the data, not necessarily going to live side by side in a nice manner that allows you to kind of create a unified view across those sources. If you're able to, most organizations, if anything, have a 90-day data or so, 30 to 90 days that they need to have in their SIEM. And so if you're able to plan to run both SIEMs in parallel for that period of time, then when you turn off your old SIEM, you've got the data in your new SIEM and you don't have to worry about it. So that can definitely save your organization a lot. The only thing about this method is this does require a lot of advanced planning and potentially an increased cost for a period of time, because you're essentially going to have some period of time where you're paying for both licenses of your SIEM product. But if you're doing that, let's say in the last 3 months of your legacy SIEM, you've spun up your new SIEM, you can kind of minimize that time frame if necessary. But there is still advanced planning required for those customers that are, or prospective people that are running out of time on their SIEM license before it expires. This one may not be an option. Okay, and so the other method is going to be your cutover method. So this is essentially your hard cutover. This is, I am taking a data feed, I am stopping it going to my legacy SIEM, and now it's going to my new SIEM. This is going to cause increased business risk because, of course, anytime you're doing a hard cutover, if there's a problem, if your new SIEM's not stabilized, or there's maybe a parsing issue or something, that's going to be a matter of increased risks. It also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of makes the content migration a little bit more difficult because I'm essentially going to have to implement the content in the new SIEM either in advance of the data being there, or I'm going to have to push the data source over first and then implement the content, but then I don't really have a great way of going back and comparing it against the legacy product. This is also, again, potentially going to cause an increased need for historical data migration because, again, it is a hard cutover. But this is going to be really the only option for customers with a very short timeline before your SIEM expires. So we have actually had instances before where a customer has called us up and said, hey, my legacy SIEM's expiring at the end of this month. Can I get on Devo really quick? We've done it. But of course, that definitely leads to an overall increased business risk for your organization. And it's not really the most optimal if you're able to avoid it with advanced planning. Okay, so here we kind of just charted the various types that we talked about based on business risk, and the lower axis there is your timeline. So as you can see, the most risky is going to be your value-based cutover. And the reason that's the most risky is because I'm doing the cutover method, which we talked about, and then the value-based, of course, the potential threat surface change is going to be a potential risk, but it's also absolutely the fastest to implement. Whereas on the other side, the slowest to implement but least risky is going to be your carbon copy parallel migration. That's where I'm able to run it side by side for a period of time, and I'm copying every piece of content over. That gives you the overall lowest risk but the longest timeline. Kind of the sweet spot where we see the most success for customers is in the value-based parallel migration or potentially the carbon copy cutover migration. But if I really had to pick one as where we've seen the most overall success with customers, it's in this value-based parallel migration. Now you can do a kind of a little bit of a hybrid. So you can say this is value-based where I'm prioritizing data ingestion, but then rather than moving all my content, maybe I'm moving some small subset of content that once I get everything into the new product, I realize, hey, this thing's great, but there's like one or two things that my legacy SIEM did that I really like to move over. And then I can, implement those there. And so that helps bring that business risk down a little bit on that value-based parallel bubble. And that's really where, in my opinion, kind of the sweet spot is for the migrations. So here we just kind of have a summary of what we talked about of kind of pros and cons of each type of migration as well as the execution method. So just, high level from value-based perspective, you're getting an increased protection profile and maximum business value, assuming, of course, that you're choosing the right SIEM and you're cautious in doing that mapping of what your protection profile is. And it's also going to give you the fastest implementation time. Cons could be an increased business risk if it does not cover all of the use cases that you previously covered. And it could require more training time for end users in this case, because now it's all new content that they're seeing. Right? It's not like they're responding to the same alerts or they're using the same dashboards that they were using before. There's a little bit more of a learning curve because everything is brand new. Carbon copy, lowest business risk since you're having the exact match of what you had before, and your training burden is going to be reduced overall, again, because it's the same set of content that they're using. Yes, the interface may be slightly different, but the actual content and everything is the same. On the con side, it is the most expensive and time consuming, and it pretty much is going to lead to you having a product that provides the same overall business value as your legacy product. So that's, again, useful for someone who maybe was only interested in the cost aspect of bringing down their overall SIM bill, but that they wanted to keep everything else. And again, carbon copy may not be possible depending upon the legacy SIM that you have. So what I mean by that is there are some legacy SIMs that have a large library of out-of-the-box detections, but they don't actually provide the visibility into seeing how those detections actually operate. And so they can be recreated from a use case perspective, but you're not going to be able to guarantee that the logic is a one-to-one mapping to what you have. As far as the two execution methods, your parallel execution is going to be your lowest business risk. It's also going to reduce or eliminate the need for historical data. But on the con side, it does require a lot of advanced planning. And then cutover is, of course, fastest and lowest cost, but has a dramatically increased business risk because of that hard cutover aspect where you're not running both products in parallel for a period of time. So now we want to talk through kind of the Devo's 4-step process. So this is anything that we've talked about so far. This process can be utilized for that. But this is the process that we try to go through with customers that are coming off of a legacy product onto Devo. And it's been shown to be successful. We've moved everything from very, very small customers ingesting less than 100 gigabytes a day into a SIM product to customers doing tens or hundreds of terabytes per day into their legacy product. And this can go as well for moving somebody who's had an on-prem SIM or a cloud-native SIM into a product like Devo. So the main 4 phases here is, first thing we have is what we call solution analysis, which is kind of the assessing of what you have in your environment right now. We'll talk through that in detail in a second. Then there's the data onboarding, which is essentially getting your data sources ingested into the platform. There's phase 3, which we call either use case implementation or data analytics. This is essentially either activation of out-of-the-box content or content that we offer if that's the desired state, or the migration of your content from your legacy SIM if that's the approach you wanted to take. And then the last phase is we hook in any external integrations that you may have, which could be single sign-ons or other things. Throughout this entire process, we wrap the whole thing in our training. So with Devo, we have an online self-paced training platform that we extend to all of our customers. And we also have a training and education team, which is one of the functions I run, that does custom instructor-led workshops for our users. We've got a set of kind of standardized ones, and we also have the ability to tune those to specific needs of the customers. But we schedule this throughout the entire implementation process, again, with the goal being that by the time you hit your go live, your users are enabled and able to operate in their new product without any drop off in productivity. And we actually also have programs for kind of ongoing education and kind of optimization long-term to increase value from the platform. But looking at that first phase in detail, we have the solutions analysis. So here's where we're going to identify everything that needs to be migrated. We're going to look for how can we improve so that you end up with something better than what you had. We'll mutually agree upon the definition of success with you and your organization. And from your side, you're going to provide us with all of the relevant queries, codes, screenshots, anything that we need with regards to your legacy content that we might need to successfully migrate you over. Anything basically that you need tuned from, translated from whatever legacy is to Devo speak, if you will. You provide that information to the services organization doing your implementation, and they assist with that. At kind of the end of the solutions analysis phase, there's a detailed project plan that will be shared with the customer that'll kind of map out in detail what the implementation looks like, what the timelines are, major milestones, and ownership of each of those. But you can see here in kind of the chart, kind of the high-level breakdown of the responsibilities from the customer side versus the Devo side in this particular phase. Essentially, the customer is largely providing information to the Devo team as necessary so that the Devo team can construct the detailed implementation plan to ensure that we meet your timelines and requirements for the actual onboarding and success of the project. Next phase is that data ingestion phase. And so this is, again, the actual pulling in of all of the various data sources. So in this phase, there's kind of, depending upon the type of the data source, the burden may be on the Devo side or on the customer side. So what we typically will do here is in phase one, we identify that prioritized list of the data sources, and then we'll start marching through those in that prioritized manner. Now, oftentimes there is a difference between pulling in on-premise sources and between pulling in like cloud-based sources. So for example, with Devo, as a cloud-native product, we can directly connect and pull in all of your cloud-based data. And so oftentimes within the first couple of days of the project, you'll already have all of your cloud-based data, whether that's Amazon, Google, Okta, any sort of cloud-based data source. We can just pull directly from those APIs and get them in. And then meanwhile, we'll work with your organization on actually deploying the on-premise data ingestion pipeline if you're going to use our own first-party software, or we'll work on integrating with you for the whatever third party. Devo doesn't lock you into using our first-party data ingestion pipeline. We support any third-party infrastructure. So we'll work with you during that to get those on-premise data sources pulled in. On the customer side, for the on-premise stuff, the burden is largely on the customer because you have to deploy the VMs necessary to do the on-premise components, and then also execute, of course, the cutover of the data source or make the IT change necessary to feed data to both platforms. If it's a cloud-based source, it's largely on Devo's side. Once the data is into Devo, the Devo personnel ensure that all your data is parsed. We maintain a library right now. We have over 3,000 out-of-the-box parsers for common technologies. We also have the ability to, in the UI, create your own auto parser for custom applications, or our services team can also create parsers on the fly as well with the typical turnaround time of 24 or 48 hours. We also have the ability to develop new collectors as required. So if you do have a cloud-based source that is not one we've integrated with previously, the professional services team will quickly turn around using our Python SDK in connection with our technology partners to develop a collector to collect that source directly without you having to pull it down on premise. Important thing here is that the customer has final sign-off at every step of this. So they will verify that they're happy with the parsing, with the data ingestion, that it's matching what they saw before we kind of move on to the next phase. And that next phase is the use case implementation. This one's fairly straightforward. The customer job in this case is validation. Devo's job is to translate that content from whatever your legacy SIEM is into Devo. So that's going to be everything that we identify in phase one, whether that's deployment of out-of-the-box content, in which case there's not really a translation that happens. There's just some button clicks to activate it, or it's the actual translation from the other SIEM language into the Devo language. This is the most time-consuming step in a carbon copy migration, and so that's something to consider. It's also a major driver of cost in carbon copy migrations because, again, you're basically paying professional services personnel to do this. Another approach that we've seen very successfully for this is where we actually, rather than paying professional services to do this, we focus more on the training side. So we teach your organization how to fish, and maybe we help you kind of do a few pieces of content, but then really the goal is to enable your team to be able to migrate content on an as-needed basis later on down the road. We've definitely seen success with that with organizations that have sufficient personnel to take on that burden. Again, customer has final sign-off, and scope is, again, the primary driver of overall project cost is this phase. Last phase is integrations. So this is really what I was talking about, is hooking in third-party systems. So this can be single sign-on, SOAR systems, ticketing systems, custom threat intelligence feeds that you may need. Really any third-party system that you need to interact with your SIEM gets hooked in sort of at this phase. And again, you have the final sign-off to ensure that the functionality matches what you're looking for before the project is essentially considered complete. Okay, and then just sort of some final thoughts before we kind of open up for questions here. Just again, kind of recapping some of these best practices. So advanced planning is, I can't harp on this one enough. Don't wait until your license is about to expire before starting to move. If your license is expiring even next year, you should at least probably start thinking about what the process is going to be. If you know you're going to want to evaluate other vendors, or if you have made a decision that you're unhappy with your current SIEM vendor, you should start that process in advance, at least the phase of understanding what it's going to look like for your organization, what your timelines are. Make sure you understand your needs. You've likely had your SIEM for an extended period of time. You've probably built up an amount of content, but it doesn't necessarily mean you actually need to move all of that. So the analogy that I always use with our prospective customers is, if you're moving your house, you're not going to pack up every single thing you have and take it with you. You're going to use that opportunity to go through and get rid of stuff that you don't need, because you don't want to waste your time or paying a mover to move stuff that you don't need. Approach your SIEM migration the same way. Make sure that you're not paying a vendor services team to migrate content that ultimately you don't need, or that you can recreate easily on your own if you end up needing it later on down the road. Accept change. Understand that, as I mentioned earlier, no two SIEM products are exactly the same. There's going to be differences. There's going to be differences in workflow, differences in UI, differences in the way that a SIEM solves a particular problem or a use case. And so be understanding of that. And when you're looking for new SIEM products, make sure that you're picking a tool that best matches your workflow, your needs, and the skill level of your platform. So this is one that I talk to a lot of prospective customers about, because there's a tendency to want to naturally gravitate to, oh, I'm going to go buy whatever's in the top right corner of the Gartner quadrant. Now, that is Gartner is certainly a very valuable tool in looking at for evaluating these. But you also need to understand the kind of capability of your SOC. If you have a 1 or 2 person SOC team, you may need something that's a little bit more packaged and less free form than some of the solutions that are on the market. So it doesn't necessarily do you that much good to buy something that's way above the capability of your organization. So just really understand what your team is what tool is best for your team, I guess. Seek to improve. So again, a one-to-one carbon migration is going to leave you essentially where you are at. But if you're taking this time to move SIEMs, don't just try to get something exactly what you had. Try to end in an overall better state, either in terms of cost or capability or, I guess, scalability, something that leaves you better off than where you started at. And make sure that you're talking with any vendor that you're looking at of how they're going to help you improve overall. Don't let them just kind of sell you on a direct one-to-one of what you had. Force them to prove how they're going to be better. And lastly is make a plan. There's the saying, plan your dive and dive your plan. That's exactly what needs to happen with the SIEM migration. So executing a SIEM migration really requires both sides to have a plan, both sides to have agreement on what that plan is, and to have identified the teams that are going to be working on the project, and ensuring communication throughout the entire project. Things change throughout the SIEM implementations. I don't think we've ever gotten through a SIEM implementation where we ended exactly the way we thought we were going to be, where there wasn't something that changed midstream. Understand that and be willing to work with that, but make sure that there's communications with both sides, so when those changes come up, they're ready to be dealt with. All right, and with that brings me to the end of the presentation here. I will go ahead and open it up. If you have any questions, if there's any topics you want to talk a little bit more about, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. But otherwise, I appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. As I mentioned earlier, the Uber Eats vouchers will be mailed out to you at the conclusion of the presentation. If there's any questions, if there's anyone wants to have additional ongoing conversations, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, my name is Andrew Riggs. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can connect with our marketing team as well. I'd be happy to have any further discussions around this topic. Or anything else related to Devo if there's interest in that conversation. Go ahead and take a look and see if we have any Q&A. Okay, I am not seeing much coming in as far as Q&A. So with that said, we will go ahead and just end the presentation. Again, thank you everybody for joining. If there's anything else that we need, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.